Welcome. My name is Victoria Schaefer, and I'm joined by my colleague, Shauna Hart.
Hello, everyone.
We both work for SIP and are honored to have the opportunity to be with you today to share strategies for developing project performance measures. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you find today's session valuable and informative. Today, we have a full agenda planned. We hope to provide you an overview of the Grantee Guide to Project Performance Measurement, which we'll refer to today as the guide, to provide a brief presentation of key concepts, and then to describe and demonstrate the functionality of tools that support project measure development. Note that we will pause a couple of times during today's presentation to ask you questions, so stay tuned and be ready to respond. If you want to ask us a question or make a comment, please do not hesitate to use the chat function. Today, we are going to share information with you from the guide. We want you to know that the guide and our presentation today start broadly, pretty broad, but ultimately narrows to a focus on just what is feasible for you to measure for your project. So if at the outset you think this just sounds too ideal, please know that we are also grounded in the reality where project budgets and feasibility of measurement play an important role in the final measure selection.
Private sector companies, nonprofit organizations, federal and state grantees, and other entities regularly use quantitative metrics or performance measures to track, monitor, and report performance. There are two main types of performance measures: Government Performance and Results Act, or GPRA measures, and project measures. GPRA measures are designed to evaluate overall performance of a program, for example, technical assistance and dissemination, or parent information centers, not individual projects. Federal programs report data on these measures to Congress. Project measures supplement GPRA performance measures and are identified by the grantee as important indicators of progress in relation to the goals of the project. Project performance measures are specific to the project. Today, we'll discuss the Grantee Guide to Project Performance Measurement, which presents an approach for helping OSEP grantees develop high-quality project performance measures and explains how GPRA and project measures are used together to meaningfully track program and project performance. Each year, OSEP grantees are required to report on GPRA and project measures, which you can think of as your portfolio of performance measures. The portfolio of measures can be useful in helping you and your OSEP project officer observe and quantify changes in progress toward achieving program and project outcomes. Those OSEP GPRA measures and your project measures reflect key points of progress toward achieving the project outcomes and can help identify areas for changes in grant management strategies to support achievement of desired results.
The guide provides tips for how to set yourself up for success. We offer suggestions for how to increase your chances of meeting your goals. Specifically, we suggest several tips to help you start strong. First, create a performance measurement team. Identify individuals from across the project, including your evaluator, who have the time and capacity to support this effort as part of a team. Charge the team with the responsibility of developing meaningful project performance measures. If possible, recruit key stakeholders or individuals who may be impacted by project activities for this opportunity. By the way, your team may also include your OSEP project officer. Second, identify team members with substantive knowledge of the project to serve in critical roles, such as a team leader to organize meetings and a secretary to maintain and distribute accurate meeting summaries. The team can identify and fill other critical team positions, such as a task leader, as necessary. Establish a meeting schedule. Develop a clear meeting schedule that suggests meeting frequency, duration, and anything else that will be important to your team's success. Be sure to consider any contextual variables, such as an expected winter break or an extended absence of a key team member, when creating your plan. Provide guidance up front regarding expectations for participation, and then hold the team accountable. Finally, identify suggested ground rules for the work and begin developing the measures. Tell the team that this assignment may require new and innovative thinking. Encourage a team spirit that fosters creative thinking and accepts all ideas in a supportive manner. Ground rules can often help new teams find a style of working together that fosters rapport, avoids one person dominating the conversation, and facilitates quick progress. So, we would like to know a bit about your expertise in performance measurement before we go further. So here's a question for you. What is your level of familiarity with project performance measurement? I'll read your response options while you respond. Are you unfamiliar, somewhat familiar, familiar, or very familiar? Oh, thank you all for responding to our question. As it turns out, it appears that most of you have some familiarity. Actually, very few of you, just a small percentage, are unfamiliar. Somewhat familiar appears to be about 25%. Familiar, it's about 40%. And very familiar, again, about 25% of you are very familiar. So again, thank you all for responding to our poll.
During this session, we'll walk through a 5-step process for measure development. Each step includes one or more Excel templates, which will help you complete the work. We'll show you the templates today, and they're available on the OSEP Ideas That Work website. We'll also provide examples of how to complete each step and the templates. Although you're not required to follow this approach and complete all the steps, we encourage you to follow the process through to the end. Step 1 is build foundational knowledge. The purpose of this step is to ensure the team has a thorough understanding of the project, its goals, and the processes through which change is expected to occur, and determine how much change is reasonable to expect and over what time period. Through this step, the performance measurement team will develop a better understanding of the current context for your project and have a solid understanding of the documentation supporting the proposed work. The documentation will inform your project measure development activities and serve as the foundation from which the measures are identified. Examples of documentation we recommend reviewing are grant-related information available from OSEP, such as the Federal Register Notice and GIPRA measures, the project logic model, research studies, and the evaluation plan. 3 key questions you should consider as you identify the most important things to measure and ensure the measures have the appropriate level of detail are: what is the purpose of your project? What do you hope and can you realistically expect to achieve? And what is the evidence base for your project? For example, who or what will achieve the change? The project performance measure should state who or what is targeted for change. For example, students or a system the project implements. How much change is expected? The project performance measures need to clearly state how much change is expected. Research literature or information on assessment, scales, or other instruments can help you determine how much change is realistic based on characteristics of your project. For example, age or grade level of the project's target population. And lastly, when will the change take place? The project performance measures need to identify a time frame for when the change will occur. Again, research literature and information on assessment, scales, or other instruments may help you gauge how long the change process might take. Each project team will determine what is reasonable for their work.
To help you with documenting the information you gathered as part of step 1, and to help make the information meaningful, we created a simple tool for you to record information. It's shown here on slide 11 and can also be found at the OSEP Ideas at Work website. Here, you see the full list of questions that we suggest you work through with your project team using the information gathered in step 1. Let's pause a moment to review the questions together. First, we suggest you document the purpose of your project. Then, we suggest you actually record what you hope to achieve. And further, how you will know that you achieved what you set out to accomplish. Finally, the third part of the tool asks you to summarize the evidence base for your project, including who or what is expected to change, by how much, and over what time period. Note also that we suggest you include detailed responses and the source of the information. We have an example of this table pre-filled on page 16 of the guide. We suggest that you take the time to record this type of information, as doing so will actually save you time in the long run. As you'll see later in our webinar, you'll need this level of detail when you develop your final performance measures. So, based on what you've heard so far, what types of documents and materials will help you build foundational knowledge, as suggested in step 1? So I will read the response options while you respond. Is it A, list of programs in the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Ed Programs? Is it B, project plan, GIPR measures, your grant application, and the guiding literature? Or is it C, the department's strategic plan? Thank you all for responding. So as we can see, well, I can see, I should say, I have your responses in front of me. So again, thank you all for responding. And it looks like almost every person selected option B. So I think we have 1 or 2 people who selected option C, and maybe 1 person who selected option A, because it's literally like less than 1%. So the correct answer is actually B. You want to review your documentation using your time to focus on what is most important for your project specifically.
The next question that we have for you is, where might you look to identify key project activities, outputs, and outcomes? The project logic model, OSEP program guidance, U.S. Department of Education strategic plan, all of the above, or none of the above? So it looks like in terms of responses, we have close to probably about 45% said the project logic model, maybe around 5% said OSEP program guidance, about maybe another 45% said all of the above, and a very small percentage said none of the above. So the correct answer is A, the project logic model, which brings us to step 2. Step 2 is identify key project activities, outputs, and outcomes. We suggest using your project logic model to brainstorm about these key items, as all the information should be available there. As a result of these discussions, you may determine that something's missing from the logic model, or that things changed after your project started. Be sure to revise the logic model and update the project and evaluation plans if necessary. The Step 2 template is available to help you record the key items from the logic model. Try to focus on the most important items in each category and avoid listing every component. Your project performance measures should reflect the most important aspects of your project work and its expected outcomes. This is a screenshot of the Step 2 template that's available to you in Excel to help you document key information from your logic model. You'll use your project logic model to identify the items that represent the project's key activities, outputs, and short, medium, and long-term outcomes. So now what we're going to do is we're going to open the Step 2 Excel template and give you a brief demonstration. Okay, so on the screen you should see the Step 2 Excel template. And I'm just going to enter that this is sample activity 1, sample activity 2, and sample activity 3. So we're going to come back to this template in a few minutes, but I just wanted to at least give you a brief demonstration of the Step 2 template.
So now we're at Step 3. Step 3 is a time of winnowing or narrowing the list of indicators. In Step 2, you made a long list of components of your projects. Now we want to really give pause and consider what is most important in terms of indicators of progress or lack thereof in your projects. So in Step 3, you will narrow the list from Step 2 to include only the most critical and meaningful project indicators. The guide includes tools to help you prioritize the activities, outputs, and outcomes. So see Step 3 Template A and Step 3 Template B. Consider having team members complete the prioritization independently first, then review the scores together. So now let's look at the tools in the guide. I refer now to Step 3 Template A. It will be automatically populated from your Step 2 work. So Step 3 Template A is the assessment of key project activities, outputs, and outcomes. This table should first contain all the information from prior Step 2, that is, the activities, outputs, and outcomes that you recorded, as you just saw demonstrated. And again, it should be automatically populated directly from the Step 2 template in Excel to this Step template, this Step 3 template. The purpose of this tool is to help sort through or rate and prioritize all of those possible indicators. First, I want to point out that there are 3 overarching categories of questions. So those 3, if you look on your screen at the light green shaded rows, is it related to your project's logic model? Is it measurable? Is it meaningful to stakeholders? Now I'm going to pause a moment and let you read the questions under each of those green shaded rows. As you can see, the sub-questions are intended to help you determine objectively whether an item is feasible and/or meaningful. In terms of scoring each of the items along these questions, keep in mind that if it is a yes for the first 3 questions, the score would be a 2. If it is a yes for the remaining questions, the score would be a 1. If you want to answer no to any of these questions, you would use a 0, and you always use a 0 for any of the questions. So finally, use the Step 3A template to enter the scores for each key item and identify the highest scoring items. We're going to demonstrate this to you in just a moment so you can see how you would see what is highest scoring. Use the Step 3 Template B to list the highest scoring items before you move on to Step 4.
So you'll use the Step 3 Template A to assess all the items you identified as the most critical. So as we set up the Excel template to copy all of the items that you listed in Step 2 into Part 2 of Step 3 Template A to make it easier to reference the items you're assessing. There are also formulas to sum all of the item scores. and the maximum score that can be achieved is 14. So now we're going to go back to our Excel file and give you another brief demonstration. So as you recall, I entered sample activities 1, 2, and 3 in the step 2 template. So now if we go over to our step 3 template A, if we scroll down, you can see in part 2, here are sample items 1, 2, and 3. So that way, as you're scoring the items and doing the assessment, you'll see that A1, A2, and A3 are listed here as A1, A2, A3. So it makes it a lot easier to reference the items that you're assessing. And I'm just going to also just enter some numbers here for A1. So that way you can see, once you scroll down and look at row 20, you can see that it automatically sums your assessment scores for you. So all you have to do is assess each item and then look at row 20, which gives you the total per item. Again, the max score is 14. So now we'll go back to our PowerPoint. The performance measurement team should discuss a threshold for scores that will advance logic model items to the next step. For example, you could look at the range of scores for the items assessed and use that information to determine an appropriate cutoff score. As another example, you could agree that all the items scoring a 7 or above, or have the maximum score of 14, will advance to the next step. Each performance measurement team will decide on what the threshold should be for advancing to the next step. Again, you'll enter the highest scoring items from step 3, template A, in step 3, template B. So in this example, all the items that scored a 7 or higher are entered in step 3, template B, and will advance to step 4. So our next question for you is, what should you do to prioritize your list of items? Assess all the items identified in step 2, identify a score threshold for items to advance to step 4, both A and B, or none of the above. So it looks like, based on responses, about 10% said A, assess all the items identified in step 2. Close to 20% said B, identify score thresholds for items to advance to step 4. And about 70% said both A and B. And then a very small percentage said none of the above. So the correct answer is C, both A and B. Assessing the items will help you determine which items are more critical to project success. And also, the performance measurement team should have discussions about the most appropriate threshold for scores that will advance items to the next step.
Okay, we have advanced to step 4. Here, you are making the final selection of items that you're going to measure. This is where you and your team give pause to reflect on the content of step 3, template B. You should really examine what made that list. And then you should look at it with a mindset of cost and feasibility of measuring. Also, think about what the indicators of progress are and make sure that that's what's reflected in the list. Avoid including everything just for the sake of doing so. Remember, more is not always better. Avoid overmeasurement. Try to reach agreement on what is the best thing or set of things to measure for your project. The step 4 template is a tool for your use in listing the final items that your team selects for advancing to performance measure development. We recommend that you identify the type of item. For example, make sure you list the activity versus outcome versus output and the item text itself. Okay, time for another question. This time, we are curious about your opinion. So we are asking you, what do you think is the most important consideration for creating the final list of project performance measures? Again, this is what do you think? Is it A, key project milestones or accomplishments that indicate progress toward achieving the outcomes? Is it B, cost and feasibility of measuring the items? Or is it C, other, where you might want to write in using the chat function to tell us something else would be your top priority for determining what would make that final list? So I'm going to pause and let you respond. Okay, thank you, everybody. So this is very interesting. So I want to let you know how people responded. So actually, most people, almost 60%, selected A, that it's the key project milestones and accomplishments were most important. It looks like about almost 30% of you selected B, cost and feasibility. But then about 12–13% of you actually selected C, something other. So we want to let you know that this is one where we don't think there's a right or wrong answer. This one is a little bit tricky, and we want to own that. So project teams can actually vary, as you see, in their opinion of what is most important. If budget is a priority, then you might choose B. You might choose C, other, if there is some sort of pressing issue, for example, in your state, maybe related to recent legislation that's passed, and that legislation is really influencing education policy where you are and where you're working. So this demonstrates that a one-size-fits-all or a cookie-cutter approach just isn't going to work for performance measurement every time. So your expertise drives your work and what you decide to measure to address project and stakeholder needs. It's all based on you knowing your project best.
Step 5 is finalize performance measure language. So in this step, you'll create and finalize the language for your project performance measures. As you recall, in step 1, you answered a series of questions to help you identify the most important things to measure. Now you'll revisit those questions to ensure that you have the specificity needed to create useful measures. You'll ask, what is being measured? Who or what will achieve the change? How much change is expected? And when will the change take place? You'll answer these questions individually and then combine the answers to create a refined, clearly specified measure that meets all of OSTEP's requirements. The Step 5 template is available to help you record the final measure text. This is an example of the Excel template that's available for you to use. You'll enter the type of item, for example, activity or output, initial item text taken directly from the logic model, responses to questions about what is being measured, who or what is expected to change, how much change is expected, and when the changes are expected to occur, and final measure text that combines responses to all of the questions. So let's walk through an example together using information that the SIP team created. So this item is a short-term outcome. The initial text from the logic model is increased knowledge of best practices for students with disabilities in elementary reading instruction among general and special educators. What is being measured? Knowledge of best practices. Who or what will achieve the change? General and special educators. How much change is expected? A 25-point increase. And when will the change take place? At the beginning and end of each school year. So if you combine this information to create a refined, clearly specified measure, what would be the final project measure text? And take just a minute to think about what the text could be. The final project measure text shown on the screen includes all the details listed in every column that would meet OSEP's requirements for an appropriate measure. So just take another minute to read the final project measure text. Okay, we just have a few reminders for you. If you decide to make changes to existing project performance measures or create new ones, be sure to work with your OSEP project officer to update both your overall project implementation plan and the corresponding evaluation plan as needed. It's critical that the performance measures you create align with your project officer's expectations for your project. Also, since performance measurement is a natural component of evaluation, make sure to include your evaluator in performance measure development and refinement processes. And lastly, make sure to visit the Ideas That Work website for this guide and also the Excel templates, as well as additional tools and resources.
So we have reached the end of our presentation now. It's time for us to hear what your questions and your thoughts are. So what questions do you have for us? If you would take just a moment and type your questions in the chat box, we will take a moment, review them, and then we'll respond.
And we see we actually had started getting some questions even early in the session, so we'll go ahead and start addressing those questions. So there are several questions about where exactly on the OSEP Ideas That Work website people can find these resources, these and other resources. So for the guide in particular and the Excel templates, you would go to the, on the Ideas That Work website, the section that says Resources for Grantees, and then in this section, and then there's a link for evaluation, and that's where you find the resources that are related to this particular webinar. So again, on the Ideas That Work website, you'll have the Grantee Guide to Project Performance Measurement that Victoria and I just described and walked through. You'll also find the Excel templates and other resources, and also a recording of today's webinar will also be available on the Ideas That Work website. And there are also other useful tools and resources, including, we see there's another question about a recommended resource for creating strong logic models. There are also resources on the Ideas That Work website related to logic model development and refinement.
So Shauna, I see we have a question about clarifying activity and output measures. So someone asked if we can describe the difference. So with regard to our use of the term activity and output, we were using those terms as they are used for logic model development and in logic models. So we want you to know that that is our framework. If you are considering the use of or thinking about the word activity, some people in logic models have that column headed labeled process or processes. So by activity, if you're one of the people in the world who label that column processes, that's fine. What we mean is activity or processes is where in your logic model you identify the critical aspects of your project work. What are the activities, tasks, subtasks, main things that you're going to be doing for your work? And then the outputs column typically follows it in a linear fashion and represents some level of count of exactly what you've done as part of those activities or processes. So also while Shauna was talking, I went ahead and looked, and we got several questions that require us to point you back to the OSEP program officer. So let me just name a couple that we've got probably 7, 8 variations of. So people have written in and talked about the APR and its due date or revisions to the APR, whether it's acceptable to create new measures at any given point in time, whether it's acceptable to revise measures, and we want to point you to your OSEP program officer to discuss any changes that you want to make or that you think you need to make and how they relate or don't to your APR and when that's due. And then there's a second point that I just want to differentiate. Someone actually had a specific question about, is it ever acceptable to have a simple count as opposed to a percentage for a performance measure? And we would say that everything in this line of work is contextual. So we can't just easily say yes or no to that. Instead, we again say you have to know your project. If you want something as a count, talk to your OSEP program officer and work with them to make sure that a count would be acceptable.
Thank you, Victoria. So I see we have another question. If project measures were already included in the grant application, how do we go about using these tools to measure outcomes? So we want to emphasize that really these are suggestions for how to approach the development of measures, the task of either developing measures or refining them. So in terms of this question, if you already had measures, the guide that we just walked you through, as well as the Excel templates that are tools available to help you, that can be really helpful if you do decide to refine the measures that you already have. So you can use these tools either to develop new measures or to refine existing measures.
So Shauna, we have a question that came in about one of the slides that I presented. So I'm going to just go back on the screen here to show this specific tool. So I'm moving back to this slide where we can see step 3, template A. And someone has written in asking about that third category, meaningful to stakeholders, where you see the row that is light green. And then someone has asked, like, how do you actually recommend that we determine what's meaningful to stakeholders? And so what I wanted to come back to is show you the slide and then show you that we have a question under it that we would want you to rate your indicator or item on. And what we are asking you to focus on is this item understandable to a reasonable third party? For example, your outside stakeholders. And what we would ask that you consider here is, what type of language are you using? Is it something that your most valuable or outside stakeholders can reasonably pick up, look at, and understand? Because if you are measuring something and reporting on it and people don't understand what it is, then it's less likely to be that valuable of a measure. So again, I've pointed back to this slide just to honor this question and say, we really are not asking you to address meaningful per se. The question right under it is this item understandable to a reasonable third party?
Okay. And Victoria, we have another question. Someone asked us if there is little or no research on the percent or amount of increase or change, what is the best way to determine this number? So we recommend, ideally, you want to have your percentage based on some sort of evidence. You want to have an objective way to identify the percentage or amount of increase or change. If this information is not available, then it's okay to really think of these numbers as your baseline. So that way you can make adjustments after you've collected your first round of data, after establishing kind of a baseline goal.
Okay, Shauna, I think there's one last question we should look at. So let me read the question for everyone. The question says, is speaking to this entire guide that we've been presenting. And someone is asking, am I correct in understanding that this is presented by OSEP as a resource, but not a requirement? And this person has further said that their project, for example, is actually in its 4th year and has established measures. And so we would say two things. One, yes, it is provided as a resource to help everyone. And then we'll also include that caveat I was talking about a bit earlier. If you have any questions or concerns, we refer you back to OSEP and make sure that you raise those to your project officer because that person can help you. Shauna, did you see any other questions come in?
I think that was it, Victoria. But
Oh.
thank you. We really want to thank you all for engaging with us and entering your questions and comments in the chat box. We appreciate your time and attention and participation in today's webinar.
Indeed. Thanks, everybody. We hope this is helpful.
Bye-bye.
Bye.